Hello and welcome to the channel. If you're new here, you are very welcome. My name is Judy and I love both traveling and history. Today we're going to visit Berlin's vast Tiergarten. Nearby there are several memorials and markers to the horrors committed by the Nazis before and during World War II. If you're interested, I have a separate video covering them in considerable detail. I'll post the link in the description box below. Today, however, I want to wrap up my trip to Berlin on a much lighter note. Tiergarten is chock full of statues, small gardens, memorials, lakes, things to see, places to go. This is a lovely spot of green in a big city. Let's go for a walk and see what the garden has to offer today on the Armchair Travel. If you think this content is interesting or useful, please like, share, and subscribe. This will help the channel grow. Travel content often involves a lot of history, and history can be really word heavy enough that the details often don't make it into a video blog. If you care to dig deeper, you can visit my regular blog on WordPress, where you'll find deep dives, travel tips, reviews, warnings, and the nuts and bolts on how to travel safely and conveniently. If you'd like to keep up with my posts, you can follow me on Twitter. The addresses are on your screen and in the description box below. I have been studying German with Duolingo, which informs me that the Germans are really big on fresh air. Tiergarten is sometimes called the Green Lung of Berlin. The park is about 500 acres in size. New York Central Park is about 650 acres, so in some ways they are comparable. The garden sits just west of the Brandenburg Gate. You can see the Start Here flag in the right side of this photo. This running map dates from before the reunification of the city. Almost every tree you're going to see in these images postdates World War II. The winter of 1945-46 was very cold, even by German standards. Berliners came out in desperation and chopped down nearly all the trees, to the point where it was all nearly gone. After that, trees were donated from all over the world to replant. The work increased exponentially in the 1960s. Now the garden is green and lovely again. Entering the Tiergarten and just past the Brandenburg Gate, which once marked the dividing line between East and West Berlin, we find the Ronald Reagan Memorial plaque. His Berlin Wall speech was delivered in June 1987. The speech is commonly known by a key line from the middle part: "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Reagan had the good luck to deliver this demand just as the USSR was beginning to disintegrate and lose its ability to control its client states, including the German Democratic Republic. It took until 1989 for his demand to be met, and in the end, it probably wasn't Reagan's speech, which was little covered at the time, that caused it. West Berlin then was on the western edge of the German Democratic Republic, a client state of the Soviet Union. East Berliners could peer through the Brandenburg Gate, if they had the nerve to get that close, and see the West, with its plentiful food and supplies, blooming economy, and freedoms that didn't exist on their side. The wall came down because of a combination of politics inside the Soviet bloc, which made it difficult for them to continue to control their client states, as well as escalating pressure from the people of Eastern Europe. And ultimately, there was some confusion over an East German directive to actually open the border. The wall and the repression that it represented and enforced would have collapsed of its own accord eventually, but I think it's fair to say that Ronald Reagan's speech gave it a pretty big nudge. This statue is called Der Rufer, which means the caller. It was cast by Gerhard Marx. There are several other versions of it planted in Germany, but this one was installed in Tiergarten shortly before the Berlin Wall fell. Art isn't just frippery and decoration, although those two things can apply. Art can demand that you think and ask questions. Sometimes the questions are very uncomfortable. Is this gender-neutral human calling to friends and relatives on the other side of the wall? Could it perhaps be calling to those who died during the war, or as a result of the Nazi atrocities, or as a result of the repression by the East Germans? Or is it merely screaming in complaint? I read on Wikipedia that the statue is dedicated to the victims of torture, which covers quite a bit of territory and seems totally appropriate. I use Google Maps to help me plan my walking tour itineraries, and while I was peering at a very tiny image on my cell phone, I came across a notation about this statue called the Lion Group. It turns out it was cast by Friedrich Wilhelm Wolff, animal sculptor. The lions shown here are quite realistic as individuals, but the group shows us something that would not happen in real life. Lions run in prides with a single male, many females, and a lot of cubs. The male lion shown here stands in a menacing pose, protecting the wounded lioness. A lioness shot with an arrow suckles one of her two cubs, while the second cub climbs over her back. The art and the design were highly praised when the statue was first shown publicly. Importantly, Kaiser Wilhelm I liked it and had it installed here in the gardens. The inscription below the statue reads, "Eternal glory to heroes who fell in the battle with the German fascist invaders for the freedom and independence of the Soviet Union." For all the memorials to people slaughtered during World War II, I think this one has the most unusual backstory, since it sits not in the Soviet sector of Berlin, but here in Tiergarten, which was always in the Western sector. After the final Battle of Berlin, Soviet troops occupied most of the city, but not here. The Soviet War Memorial commemorates the 80,000 soldiers of the Soviet armed forces who died just during the Battle of Berlin in April and May of 1945. I've seen monuments inside the former Soviet Union, but this is among the nicest that I've ever seen. They appropriated the stones for it from the ruined Reich Chancellery, which is not very far from here, and somehow is appropriate. After the battle was over, and long before there was a wall, one of the first things the Red Army authorities did was to authorize a Soviet War Memorial. The Soviets were in a lather to get this thing built and sited it less than a mile or so from the Reichstag. Whether they planted it in the British sector by design or by accident is still up for debate. When the Berlin Wall went up in 1961, the wall blocked the Soviets from actually getting to the memorial. Even so, the western side continued to allow honor guards to stand at the monument. Each side did considerable evil during World War II. The Soviet Union, with considerable help, won this battle, and winners write history. I can't blame the Russians for never wanting to forget, or for holding a grudge, but they did terrible things too. Alliances only last for as long as they are useful to each side, and yesterday's enemies frequently become today's friends, while today's friends are likely to become tomorrow's enemies. Tiergarten might have been in the western sector, but I've learned that all of the Allies supported building this, and I don't think the then West Berliners ever had the nerve to tear it down. Mother Russia currently is out of favor with today's Germany, which is sided with Ukraine in the Russia-Ukraine war. I suspect the monument will still be standing by the time I get there, but I also suspect it will be defaced. This statue is one of many Amazons to be found here in the city. The title of this equestrian statue refers to Amazon warriors. Amazons were a mythical nation composed only of women. They were what they called Aryans. The Aryan race is an obsolete historical concept that emerged in late 19th century Germany to describe people of Proto-Indo-European origin as a racial grouping. The Germans identified with this grouping and suggested that people living in the areas now were mere interlopers who should be expelled. The existence, even in mythology, of a so-called Aryan race provided some of the intellectual basis for Nazi plans to conquer all of that part of the world where they had been, depopulate it of lesser races, and repopulate it with clones of themselves. This memorial celebrates three so-called German musical superstars. It was commissioned by Kaiser Wilhelm II. The memorial suffered considerable damage during World War II and was only finally fully restored in 2005. Interesting, to me at least, is the fact that while the Kaiser might have claimed Mozart, and Mozart was later appropriated by the Nazis, in fact, Mozart wasn't German. He was from Salzburg, in modern Austria, but during his lifetime, Salzburg was independent. It wasn't until 1805 that it was annexed into the Austrian regime. Germany has had more than one gay emancipation movement, although it went by different names. I think, however, this memorial might be to the 21st century effort. Homosexual behavior was illegal in 19th and 20th century Germany, but was widely tolerated, at least in the cities, until the Nazis came to power. Many homosexual men even served in the military during World War I. They were apparently good enough to serve, fight, and die for the fatherland, but after 1933, no longer good enough to be allowed to keep breathing. Homosexuals were among the first groups to be marginalized and targeted for extinction, with the enthusiastic support of many German citizens. Today, the country is legally tolerant of homosexuality. This unusual monument is just outside the park and was designed to be eye-catching and to not fit in with pretty much anything around it. I think this was perhaps the designer's deliberate choice. It was installed in 2017. The Rose Garden is one of many separate small areas and dates from 1909, when it was created to showcase specimen rose bushes. Much of it was destroyed during World War II. What remained after World War II was finally only redesigned and replanted in 1974. The English Garden is a separate park within the park, complete with walkways, memorials to military heroes, a lake, and what's billed as an English tea house. Before I researched this, I imagined the moniker might have derived from the landscaping style, and there is an element of truth to that, but there is far more to the story. By the end of World War II, this entire park had been stripped bare. All of the trees had already been cut down for fuel, and the winter of 1945-46, one of the coldest in living memory, guaranteed that anything that was left would go up in smoke as well. Starting in the late 1940s, the English royal family donated trees for replanting the park, as well as for the cost of constructing this garden. It was inaugurated in 1952, and given the name English Garden in honor of those whose finances had made it possible. Bellevue Palace, which has always gone by a French, not a German name, sits just north of Tiergarten. It has been the official residence of the President of Germany since 1994. The original building, much repaired over the years, dates all the way back to 1786. It was originally built as a home for Prince Augustus Ferdinand of Prussia, Master of the Knights of the Order of St. John. Augustus was the youngest brother of Frederick II, also known as Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great died without male heir. He was succeeded not by his younger brother, but by Augustus's son, Frederick William II. Berlin city lore tells us that toward the end of World War II, the local citizens buried some of the still surviving statues and decorations from Tiergarten in the grounds you see here. This monument stands in tribute to Helmuth Karl Bernhard Graf von Moltke, or more often referred to as Moltke the Elder. He was a fine military strategist who masterminded Prussian victories over Austria and France in the latter part of the 19th century. The monument caught my eye not because of its location, it's just across the circle from the Siegessäule, or the clothing, but because of its odd pose. It shows von Moltke wearing a field marshal's uniform with the German Iron Cross around his neck. The odd part is he's shown with his hands clasped together in front, but leaning backwards on a balustrade. Was he tired? Gloating over his victories? Resting? No one has ever been able to explain this to me. Siegessäule means victory column or victory pillar, and is one of those dreadful compound Franken words so beloved by the Germans. It sits in the middle of Tiergarten and was built between 1864 and 1873 on the occasion of a Prussian victory over Denmark that had occurred in 1864. The tower sits in the middle of a traffic circle, shown on the right from a nearby office building. There are tunnels to get under the roundabout safely. There are also shrapnel scars in the foundation granite. On top is a Roman goddess of victory, who the Berliners call Goldische, which means something like Golden Lizzie. She personifies victory. Now that we've gotten to the Siegessäule, the victory column, I plan to call it a day. There are dozens of statues, ponds, memorials, and gardens scattered all over this park, as well as a zoo on the far western edge. It's a lot like the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris. Decide what part of it you really want to see and zone in on that part. There is no way to see all of it in one day or even one visit. Perhaps when I get to Berlin, I'll carve out an entire day to visit this park. The Victory Column stands in front of a city bus stop, and that line will run me right to the KaDeWe. I am really looking forward to exploring this rather old-fashioned department store, which dates from 1907, with beauty products, gourmet food, fashion, home goods, and several restaurants. The exterior looks to me for all the world like a train station, as does the interior. It's pretty, there are wooden floors, there's a multiple level escalator that is absolute eye candy. The restaurant on the top floor might be expensive, but might also be worth it. Recently, and if these photos are accurate, spectacularly remodeled, the Cas d'Ave is definitely worth a side trip. On the left, you can see one of the buffet restaurants, looking out and up through what appears to be a twin to a train hall, and on the right, the multiple level escalators situated in a swirl. I am really looking forward to exploring German food, much of which is actually familiar to me, though not by the German names. I grew up in an area of the United States where many Germans settled, and in the case of my father's family, well before the American Revolution. They all gave up their language fairly quickly, but the food lives on. Bauernfrühstück means farmer's breakfast. This is a kind of all-in-one dish meal intended to keep a farmer, or a combat infantryman, should he have access to heat, a pan, and a material, going for quite a few hours. Shown on the left is the more elegant omelet style. However, any cook can bungle an omelet. The trick here is to make the mistake look deliberate. If you bungle the omelet form, you loudly declare it's a hard scramble and dive in. I hope you enjoyed our walk through the Tiergarten this week. Come back next week as we move on to Bavaria, here on The Armchair Traveler.